I doubt that it is an amazing thing to anyone who's been around in our world for very long to know that there is more and more the idea of the use of intoxicants as being acceptable. That's something that would not have taken place among God's people when I was a very young boy. If it was going to be done at all, it would be done so secretly that nobody even knew it. But in recent years, I've talked with those who are supposedly gospel preachers who have made arguments that it's all right to use wine, it's all right to even use some of the distilled spirits, as long as you don't get drunk. That's all that the Bible has to say about that. And what we're going to do is look and see what the Word of God has to say with regard to that. And as we do, I want you to keep passages like this in mind. We're going to go through several of them from the Old Testament, and we're also going to look at New Testament teaching on the matter. But in the 23rd chapter of the book of Proverbs, the wise man said, "Do not look on the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it swirls around smoothly. At the last it bites like a serpent and it stings like a viper." Now when he points out that fact, do not look on the wine when it's red in the cup, I want to ask us a question as we go through this. Is that saying you're not to look on it? Now if you drank it, that would be fine, but you're not to look on it when you drink. Is that the point that's being made here? And when you look at things, it's a very simple matter to see the fact that that can't possibly be the idea. And so there's a point that the Word of God in wisdom tells us you ought to be extremely cautious of that. That's what this is saying. It's not saying that there's actually a sin in looking on it. It's talking about the idea of having such extreme caution that we recognize the problem with regard to intoxicants. When we read that, how can the same book instruct us that we can deal with that in anything short of what could be called drunkenness and be all right? It doesn't make sense. And therefore, we need to look a little bit more deeply at some of the passages that we're talking about. Can we drink if we don't get drunk is something that I have seen a number of times from those who are brethren in Christ who said as long as we partake of that moderate consumption in a non-medicinal way, we're all right. I understand the fact that there is a solvent in alcohol that is used in many medicinal kind of ways. I don't have a problem with that, and that's not what this lesson is about. It's about the recreational, the non-medicinal use. Can we do that in such a way that it's just a daily occurrence? It can be done for our recreation or for our kind of a benefit of day-to-day life, just in easing our mind or whatever else. That's what we're going to look at. Does the Bible approve of it? Well, if it does, we have to have a passage for that, because we recognize that we're to do all in the name of the Lord. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 17, whether it's in word or in deed. So if I'm going to teach that it's all right, I need a passage for that. And if I'm going to practice that it's right and do that myself, I need to have a passage for that. And that's what we're going to look at this evening. How do we understand passages then that warn against it, like this one? Don't look at it when it's red in the cup. Or how is it that we can say, well, drunkenness is wrong, if we don't even know what drunkenness is? I've had people come along and say to me, you know, if you just get a buzz, that's not drunk. That was a preacher, by the way, who said that. We can get a buzz, but we cannot be drunk. Well, then how am I to define that idea of drunkenness? In essence, what that does is it has someone who claims to be a child of God using the same terminology and having the same message as the liquor industry. Their idea is you drink, but you drink responsibly. In other words, you drink that which takes away your responsibility, but you do that in taking away your responsibility responsibly. Now, if you can figure that one out, tell me how. Because that's exactly what the point is of the language of the liquor industry. And some of our brethren are starting to sound much the same way. Can we mirror the call then of the world and yet claim to live by a higher moral standard? And we're going to notice that that's not just something that we talk about as a good idea. That's what the Word of God demands. It's very clear with regard to that our standard cannot be at that low point of the world. And so we need to look at the Bible closely. There is no secret to the fact that the Bible uses the word wine. And it talks about the idea of a strong drink. And there are things that people look at when they see that word wine, and they automatically have some sort of an idea, well, that's talking about the same thing that we could buy down at the liquor store. And what we're going to look at is a little bit more careful study of words and of text, and see what the Bible teaches about that. Let me suggest something. People say sometimes, well, it's all right if I drink my beer, but I wouldn't drink that cocktail over that. That's not something that I'd drink at all. I want you to understand something, that when you're talking about one 12-ounce beer, one 4-ounce cocktail, 1.5 ounces of whiskey, what's called a shot, or the sherry or the wine, the one serving of that is in essence the same amount of alcohol. You can see that every time when those who are involved in the Public Department of Safety, the highway people, they tell us about these things in their lectures. And their point is, don't think that because you have something that has a lesser alcoholic content, that in that you can't possibly get drunk. No, if there's more fluid ounces of that, then you've got more of that there. And however much you have, that alcohol amount is going to be about the same with all of those. And might I also suggest, when we go back there, that the typical point from law enforcement is to tell you that if you have 2 of these in an hour, you're legally drunk with regard to the way the highway department looks at it, or you'd get a ticket for being drunk driving if you had 2 of those within an hour. When we look at the Old Testament, there is a general condemnation of intoxicants. Go with me over to the book of Proverbs. We're just going to look real quickly at a few verses. In Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 1, wine is a mocker, and strong drink is a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise. Generally, the point is, don't drink it. You're being foolish if you do. In Proverbs chapter 23, we noticed a part of this in that chart at the very first. But let's notice the full context. In Proverbs chapter 23 and in verse 29 beginning, who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has contentions? Who has complaints? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of the eyes? Those who linger long at the wine, those who go in search of mixed wine. Do not look on the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it swirls around smoothly. At the last it bites like a serpent, and it stings like a viper. Your eyes will behold strange things, and your heart will utter perverse things. Yes, you will be like one who lies down in the midst of the sea, or as one who lies at the top of the mast, saying, they have struck me, but I was not hurt. They have beaten me, but I did not feel it. When shall I awake that I may seek another drink? There's somebody that we recognize very clearly, some drunk who's out there who doesn't even realize what's going on. Now, who gets to that point? Who has these wounds that they don't remember? Who has these fights that they don't remember being in? Well, you know, when I was growing up, we heard about that taking place at the bars in town, didn't you? And that's still the way that it is. That's associated with that kind of behavior, because it takes away that effect of an inhibition of doing some of those things and involving self in many of those things. When you look over at Proverbs, the 31st chapter, you see another point that is made. In a general rule, he said, it is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes intoxicating drink, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the justice of all the afflicted. Give strong drink to him who is perishing, and wine to those who are bitter of heart. Let him drink and forget his poverty, and remember his misery no more. I'm not sure that it's talking about in verses 6 and 7 that is something that is a path of suggestion to them. Or is that a satire that is being used by the writer? I rather think it's the latter. In other words, for somebody who's wise, like a prince or a king, he's not to drink. Someone who wants to preserve themselves, they're not supposed to drink. Go ahead and give it to somebody who's dying. He's going to get there anyway. That might speed him up. I think that's the point of it. It's talking about that in a facetious way. Now, if it were talking about a medicinal use, I don't have a problem with that, as we've talked about. That's not what's under discussion. We're talking about the recreational, social use of that, not for something that's needed as a medicine. But most likely the idea is of that which is facetious. Whatever the case, if I could show that this is an exceptional case of medicinal, then that exceptional case does not make us reinterpret the rule. We recognize that it is an exception to that, just as it is. When we look at the Word of God and we recognize the fact that we are not to put away a spouse, and then you go over to Matthew 19:9 and it says, except for fornication, does that mean we can throw it all out and everything's okay? That there was one exception, so there's bound to be more? No. What it means is, here's the exception to that rule. And if there is an exception with regard to the things being stated here, rather than being used facetiously, then it's talking about a medicinal use. And that does not change the rule whatsoever. In Isaiah chapter 5, the statement of the prophet is made very clear there as he pronounces woe upon those who are going away from God. He says, woe to those who rise early in the morning that they may follow intoxicating drink, who continue until night, till wine inflames them. I want you to remember that statement, that they continue long at it until wine inflames them when? The night. They started in the morning and they became inflamed at night. Now I ask you something. Does that sound like the wine that you're used to hearing about in our time? Does it take you the imbibing of that all day long, and finally at night there is an inebriation that comes with, oh no, 2 drinks in an hour and you're drunk legally? There's something that's different, and we can reason about that when we even see the context. Why does it say that? We may be missing something about the alcohol of that time, what they would have used and why they would have used it, and what's being used today and why it's used. Over in the 22nd verse, much the same, woe to men mighty at drinking wine, woe to men valiant for mixing intoxicating drink. In other words, here's someone who's going to be mighty and strong. That person who's going to be mighty and strong is not going to be that if they follow after the drinking. If they're going to go after the intoxicants instead of being those who are mighty, that have that ability in warfare, who have that strength, that's going to be taken away from them by that one. And that's exactly what Isaiah is warning about. In Hosea chapter 4 and verse 11, it warns of the fact that wine and harlotry enslave one. And indeed, that's true. It isn't hard on almost any week for you to open up the paper where I am, and I'm imagining it's much the same thing, where there's some prostitution ring where somebody put them into what they call white slavery. They took them from places, maybe as a child or maybe from a different place in the world, and they brought them over here and they're enslaved in prostitution. You know what? That's a horrible thing that we recognize as intensely evil. Wine does that. And that's what the exact point of the liquor industry is. To get one so dependent on it that they keep enriching themselves through the drinking of that which enslaves that one to the wine. In Leviticus chapter 10, there's a statement in verses 9 and 10 with regard to the Levites and the priests about this. Do not drink wine or intoxicating drink, you nor your sons with you, when you go into the tabernacle of meeting, lest you die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that you may distinguish between holy and unholy, and between unclean and clean. Then he goes on to point out, and also that you might teach the children of Israel the statutes of God. When you look at that point, there is a problem that he says with drinking this intoxicant. What is it? He says it's going to take away your ability to judge between the holy and the unholy, the unclean and the clean. In other words, you don't make those distinctions because that mind is blurred in that. As a result of that, you're not able to teach the true statutes and commandments of the Lord if you're going to go out there and involve yourself in that. So what the point is that you keep away from that drink which is going to take away your ability to make those distinctions, to wisely reason. I want you to think about something. In the New Testament, we are to be priests. We don't have a Levitical priesthood anymore. The point in Christ is that we are all priests, able to come before the throne of God. How is it that the Old Testament priests could not drink? Because when they did that, at any time, forever, that was a continuous statute, they would take away that opportunity to tell between the unholy and the holy, between the clean and the unclean. And yet are you trying to tell me that Christians can do that, and that's just fine in the sight of God? God forbid. That doesn't make sense when we look at it. When you see the Old Testament, the warnings against that are very clear. There are 3 words that are used in the Old Testament in the Hebrew to talk about this idea of something that is sometimes thought of as an intoxicant, what is translated at some time wine or strong drink. There is the word tirash. It's used 38 times over in the Old Testament. It refers most of the time to what we would call grape juice. Generally, it's approved for that which is of consumption. Now, if that surprises you, and someone says, well, why are you talking about grape juice? We're talking about wine. When you look in most of the older translations, tirash will be rendered wine a number of times in the Old Testament. When you look at that, and you see what was so in the English language just about 100 years ago, you would notice much the same thing. I've got an ad for Welch's grape juice, as we call it, from the first decade of the 1900s. But that isn't what they called it then. You know what they called it? They called it Welch's grape wine. Because it was something that even in the English language, that word had not developed to the point where it inherently meant something that was an intoxicant or something that had been fermented and having an alcoholic content. When you look in the King James or in the American Standard, you see the rendering the wine which is within the cluster of the grape. Now I want to ask you, what's in that cluster of the grape? The word is tirash. It's used with regard to that which is what we would call fresh grape juice. But it's sometimes rendered that way. So I need to look and see what is the rendering of that. I might add that in many of the newer kind of not really translations, but some of the paraphrases that are used, they have a liberal use of the word wine as well in the Old Testament, sometimes for this word tirash that is used. The second word that is used is always something that is generally condemned. Shekar, it's used 22 times in the Old Testament. It denotes that which is strong drink. Most of the time, that's the way it's rendered in the older translations. Its alcohol has been raised by having there to be a more of a sugar content in it. A lot of times, it isn't that which comes from the grape. If it's something that comes from the grape, it has been boosted or enhanced in that way through added sugar. When you have yeast and you have that sugar, that goes together, and the amounts of that are necessary to make that alcohol in fermentation. The more that you have of that, the more that fermentation is possible in that way. Modern alcoholic beverages would all fit into this group. Yet let me suggest you something to you. You cannot find one single passage in the Old Testament where the word shekar is used, where it talks about something that is approved for that social or recreational use. For medicinal, yes. For there to be a sacrifice, yes, but not one that was drunk by one. When you talk about something for that of consumption that's there, you won't find shekar at any time being that which is approved without any problem. There's a third word that's used, and it's the word that's used most of the time when the word wine is referred to in the Old Testament. It's the word yayin, or some of them put the word as yanin. It's generally something that has some alcoholic content, but not always. It's also a word that is used with regard to what comes from the grape as it is in the winepress. Clearly, that's not something that's fermented and alcoholic in its nature. But it's normally used with some alcohol being there. About half of the time, it's clearly that which is forbidden. Looked at it, that which is wrong. The passages that we looked at in the book of Proverbs, when the word wine was there, that was this word yanin that is used each time. It is approved for non-consumptive use. For instance, there is that which is poured out for an offering at the altar. And in that way, it's something that is approved to be there. The Jews, generally in the latter period of our Old Testament history, looked at three distinct kinds of yayin or yanin. There was that which was to get drunk. There was that which was for an ability to purify. And there was something that was kept as best they could away from any kind of a fermentation. So they divided it into those three. Now, why are we looking at all of these Hebrew words? Real simple. When you and I see the word wine, we automatically think, I saw that on the store. That has an alcoholic content. That's not necessarily so in the Old Testament. What we need to do is go back and do a little bit of word study first. But in the New Testament, we're going to get to something, and this applies in the Old as well, but I want to look at it especially from the New Testament, that you have this problem even more. Because when you look at the New Testament, there is a condemnation of drunkenness. It's seen in Galatians chapter 5 as being the works of the flesh. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, or chapter 6 and verse 10 rather, you have those who were drunkards, but they've been washed, they've been justified, they've been sanctified in the name of Christ. Those who continued in that, Paul said, will not inherit the kingdom of God. In Romans chapter 13, you have this intoxication that's spoken of in the world of darkness. But he says we're not to live in darkness, whereas those of the light. So let's leave that path behind. When you look at, we're going to look at 1 Peter chapter 4 a little bit later, so I'm going to skip it. In Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 18, it condemns something that's called wine wherein is riot. And I want you to think about that for just a minute. Wine wherein is riot. The riot or excess is said to be in the wine. Grammatically, it makes that point very clear. It's not in the one that's drinking. He would be made drunken. But the riot, he says, is inherent in the wine. What's that talking about? If we talk about wine today, we might recognize, well, sure. If you go out here and you drink something that's 16 to 18% alcohol by volume, which is the typical wine today, sometimes a bit more, then you're going to get drunk in that, and there's going to be a time of riot that's there if you polish off the bottle. But the point is, that's not the riot that's in the person, that's the riot that's in the wine. There's something different about it and some others that are not inherently condemned with regard to their drink. Was there a kind of wine in New Testament time that had that riot in it, that it inherently was for that purpose, and another kind that did not inherently have that? That's something unknown to us. We'd say, no, obviously, it's something that's going to cause that. That's not so in New Testament times. When you look at the word that's used for wine, the word in the Greek language is the word oinos. That Greek word could talk about something that's freshly squeezed from the grape or something that's fermented to its maximum ability to ferment. It's the same word. You can't distinguish by the word that is used of oinos which one it is, because it's simply that which comes as a product from the grape. Whatever the origin, however, whether we're talking about that which is freshly or fermented, the mixture was called wine when they actually mixed water with that which we would call wine. Let me try to prove that. Plutarch said it this way. He said, we call a mixture wine, he used the word oinos, although the larger component parts is water. Or when you look at Everett Ferguson in his an encyclopedia of early Christianity, he said the ordinary table beverage of the Mediterranean world was a mixture of wine and water. You get that in the New Testament several places, but especially in the book of Revelation, when it talks about the wine of God's wrath being served unmixed. That's how you would talk about a kind of a wine that was not diluted with water. The normal, as Plutarch and as Brother Ferguson pointed out, are those that are used in such a way as the mixture of that, not just that which was alcoholic in its nature. So the modern wine that we have is not what's being talked about in the New Testament. I have to be honest if I'm going to approach this subject and use terminology in its rightful way. So I've got to go back and put in context what is being talked about with that. When we say that there was a mixture of water and wine, that's not just something that's a supposition from those two guys that I gave you. I want you to notice that in ancient literature that's very clearly pointed out. Homer in the Odyssey gave the ideal wine as a mixture of 20 parts water to 1 part of what we might call wine. 20 to 1. You come along to Pliny, and he talks about, to maintain the order in Rome, he discussed the fact that 8 to 1 would be the right combination to use. Anything stronger than that would not be good. He's not a Christian. He's one that's looking at it from a societal order point of view. When you look at Athenaeus, he talks about 3 to 1 there. And you have 4 to 1 by Alexis. Hesychus talks about that being the idea of 3 to 1, the same thing from Ian and the Talmud. So there are several who have that, but that's at the low end of everything. You look at others and they're going to have something else. Clement, who was an early writer who was a Christian, said it is best for the wine to be mixed with as much water as possible. That was his statement. Because the point was, what you had is water that was not always pure. And if you added that wine, which had some level of fermentation to it, then what would take place? You would have a cleansing effect from that. And that's what he talks about at some length. But he says, put as much water in there as you possibly can. Why? Because he's concerned about the effect of the alcohol. And the point is, wisdom would mean you put as little of that as you can possibly get by with, and yet you still have the purification process that goes on from that. Now, I could tell you, here's what I find, and probably if you look at all of the things, and there are literally in my file over 120 the last time I counted, references from the ancient world as to the mixture between water and wine. But if I was going to say what's probably about the median one, the average of there would be about 6 to 8 to 1, water to wine. But let's go with the low one, okay? Let's make the best possible case we can for the moderate social drinker. And if I was going to do that, and I went down to that case that was there, what I'd do is I'd say, all right, in the Bible lands, there's well-documented point that the alcoholic content that's maximum from the grapes with the yeast and the sugar that was available at that time, now they've boosted that through the way that they make these hybrids. But at that time was about 6 to 8% wine by volume in what came from natural fermentation. Now almost everybody I see says 5 to 6, but I'm throwing in that 8 one. I only found that once, but we're going to use that one, okay? We'll use that 8 one to be that, and we'll say, okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to ignore the fact that they could have kept this without fermentation. That was well known in the ancient world. To pour about a ½ inch of olive oil over the top of that wine, that oinos, would keep it from having the oxygen. That oxygen was necessary for you to have the fermentation process. So that was one way of doing it. Another was you boil that wine, and that killed off the yeast, and then you didn't have the fermentation process going. But let's just ignore that. Let's say that they didn't have that, and we got it to its maximum amount. We let that reach 8%. And what we're going to do, rather than just let it be cut anywhere from 3 to 6, we're going to say 3 to 1 is what we'll assume. So now what do you got? What you've got is a drink that's 2% alcohol by volume. you cannot buy a wine anywhere on the market with 2% alcohol by volume today. The California wines have about 16 to 18, some of them as much as 22% alcohol by volume. Some of the French wines are down in the area of 14 to 16, some of them up at the 18. Generally, California wines having more. But here, at most, what I could prove would be something that would have 2% alcohol by volume. Now, if you know anybody that's going to be careful about this and say, all right, now I need to take this, I need to read the label, and I want to dilute this down until it's 2% alcohol by volume, I'll be glad to talk to them about the rest of what the problem is. But the fact of it is, that's not what's happening. They're taking that straight stuff, which the Word of God would call shekar, strong drink. They would be doing that which even the non-Christians would look at as barbaric and involved in something that would quickly get one intoxicated. The typical beer that's out there is about 8%. Modern wines, anywhere from, like we talked about, distilled spirits being about 40% alcohol by volume. So we aren't comparing apples with apples when we talk about drinking something of what's done there in alcohol, of beers, wines, any kind of liquor product. That's a different thing than what's there. Any of that would be strictly forbidden and strictly condemned right from the very start as strong drink. It would take 22 glasses of that New Testament wine, 22 glasses, to equal just what 2 glasses would. Because your kidneys, when they work through that, are going to slough off. You would have to have that amount to get the effect of that alcohol to be the same. Now, I don't want to be indelicate, but I'm going to tell you something. You're going to have problems with something else a long time before you have problems with your mind with that. The fact of it is, that would be something that we would recognize and is at an exorbitant amount. Do you start to see why it talks about someone who starts with that wine in the morning and they continue all day long? Does that make a little bit more sense? That's how it was done. That they would have that kind of wine. It would be a tarrying at that for a long time. You don't have to tarry long today. 2 drinks and you're out of it with regard to the idea of being drunk by any standard of the law. When you look at 6%, if it's 6% and it's cut at 4-to-1, do you know you would have to drink 2.5 to 3 gallons an hour to get that same level of alcoholic effect as 2 drinks would get you of modern alcohol? Now, I'll guarantee you're going to have some problems there. But it's not going to be with somebody who's going to get drunk, probably. You're talking about somebody who's just going to be at it and will have some other matters that will be a problem. The most liberal case I can make for the New Testament times doesn't even come close to what the so-called moderate drinkers that are sometimes among God's people want to try to say is all right. I've talked with college professors, I've talked with gospel preachers, I've talked with various people. When I was in Florida, there was an elder. His child got married. When they had the reception, they had champagne. That was not mock champagne, the real stuff, and dancing right out there. I'll tell you, this is something that's happening among various places that we see. And the problem is that they haven't looked to see what are we talking about with regard to the wine that would have been there. Their concept is it's just okay. Let's go out here and not have any problem with it. Now, if I forgot every bit of that, I'd still have a problem with social drinking. And it's a problem that's explicitly stated in the text of the New Testament. In 1 Peter chapter 4, starting out with verse 1, "Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind, for he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he should no longer live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lust of men, but for the will of God. For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regard of these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. I want to draw attention to those three words. In the New King James, drunkenness, revelries, and drinking parties. If you're using an American Standard, the words that are used there for those three are wine bibbings, revelings, and carousings. Or if you have a King James, excess of wine, revelings, and banqueting. I remember when I was a kid, I thought it was wrong to go to a place where you dressed up and ate food. It was a banquet because the Bible talked about it being wrong. Well, the problem is that wasn't the word that was used in the original language. When you look at 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 3, it's talking about something where there are two ways of life. One of them is living according to the mind of Christ, and the other one is living a life that's after the lust of men. And Peter said, don't live that life after the lust of men, live after the mind of Christ. Now, what are the things that are talked about? In this list of sins, there are three things that deal with the alcoholic beverage, or that which is intoxicating in some sense. There's this word drunkenness, elsewhere in the American Standard, wine bibbings, or excess of wine in the King James. That's the word oinophleugia, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Real simple to find out what that means. It's well used in the Greek world. The word revelries or revelings is the word komos that is used in the original language. And the last one, drinking parties or carousings, what the King James calls banquetings, is the word patos. Now, in each of these, what you're going to notice is that there is an order that's given that's important. That first one, of oinophleugia, it's translated wine bibbings, excess of wine, along with drunkenness. Trench talks about it as it marks a step in advance of methe. Methe is the word for drunkenness that's used, for instance, in Romans 13 and other places. So it's something that's beyond just drunk. This is a person that's really drunk. They're way out drunk. They're dissipated in that alcoholic state. That's the way it's used in the works of the flesh in Galatians 5. When you have reached that point of oinophleugia, you've lost control. It's the idea of wine that is used to that point. Aristotle uses this word as talking about when you have a permanent harm that comes to the body. That's that use of the word oinophleugia. Or it's what's used with regard to Arian in describing Alexander the Great when he died in a drunken debauch. In all of that, what we see is that it's a drunkenness where one is prone to passing out. Ever seen the guy who's down in the gutter drunk? When I was over in Lithuania, you saw that all the time. I figured out why pretty quickly. It was about 3 times more to buy water than it was to buy vodka. And if you were going to buy a Coca-Cola, that was at least 10, sometimes 20 times more expensive than vodka. What do you think they drank a lot of? And as they did so, a lot of times we'd be going back to the bus stop and there would be somebody passed out drunk, sometimes lying in his own vomit, and it was absolutely disgusting. But that's the kind of debauchery that one gets. There's then a word of revelries, the word komos in the original language. Arndt Gingrich, probably the best lexicon of Koine Greek that's available, they say that originally was a festal procession. In other words, this is what komos had reference to. This festal or festival procession in honor of Dionysius, then a joyful meal of a banquet in the New Testament, only in the bad sense of excessive feasting. And he means by that feasting with regard to a drunken beverage being involved. Thayer talks about it, a nocturnal and riotous procession of half-drunken and frolicsome fellows who after supper parade through the streets with torches and music in honor of Bacchus and some other deity, and sing and play before houses of their male and female friends, hence used generally of feasts and drinking parties that are protracted till late at night and indulge in revelry. Now that isn't to the point of oinophleugia, where you passed out. This is the guy who has the lampshade on his head. He's going around singing 99 bottles of beer on the wall. There's a difference between the two, but they're both involved in some level. Oinophlogia, more advanced, and this one less than that. It's really what you see if you talk about the Mardi Gras goers or the bar scene. That's the perfect word that was used in the Greek language to describe that kind of thing. So we had the one that's passed out. Then we've got the happy drunk, but that isn't the last word that's used. The last word that's used is the word patos, translated a drinking party in the New King James. R.C. Trench talked about it as not of necessity excessive, but giving opportunity for excess, of drinking that wasn't excessive, but it could be if it carried on. Kiestemacher pointed the very same thing and quoted Trench and said that was a good definition of it. The primary definition, however, if you just go to a lexicographer, will be simple. It means a drinking. That's what it means in the literal sense. There are two other words that are akin to that. The word cup is the word paterion. That's just another form of it. Paterion, a cup, doesn't necessarily mean something that was intoxicating. But if it was in the context of that which had to do with intoxicants, then you would say, oh, a cup of that intoxicant. Or when you talk about the word potizo, that means I drink. Now we talk about that fella's drinking. Well, I do too. I drink my water pretty regularly. I drink my coffee every morning. But we know when someone says he's drinking, that there's a distinction when it's in the context of somebody that's drinking alcohol, somebody that's drinking an intoxicant. And so that word, whether you're talking about patos or paterion or potizo, it has that sense of if it's in the context of that which is intoxicating, it would mean what? A drinking of an intoxicating drink. Not excess, but a drink, or a drinking of that. When we were over in Lithuania, I was interested to see what that word meant in the Lithuanian Bibles. And they were very used to the idea of going out and partaking of alcoholic beverages. They didn't have any problem with that. There was no social stigma whatsoever about it. And I asked a couple of our translators, read for me that verse. What does that say? Well, that first word, that drunk, oh, that's somebody, oh, he's passed out. Okay. How about that second word? Oh, that's somebody, you know, they're happy, they're singing. Okay. What's that next word? And every one of them go, that just means drinking. Do you mean it's wrong for me to drink my vodka? I didn't even have to say it. They recognized the point of that. I've seen the same thing in some of the translations of that very word as it's used over in the dialects in the Philippines. The point is, if you're just going to translate that, you would say it's a drinking of something that was intoxicating in its nature. Now with that, if I come along and in context see that it's drinking of something that is an intoxicant, but not necessarily excessive, because that's what the two previous words had, then what do I come to? I come to the conclusion that has to be talking about that moderate drinking. That's describing it right down the line. It necessarily implies that that kind of drinking is indeed sin. Why? Because it's mentioned among those things that ought not to be a part of what the Christian should be. Now, folks, that's not hard to understand. And if it wasn't for a practice that had become so common, it'd be easy to understand simply by looking at what happened. I tell you what, I've known enough people who've gone into the drunkenness to where they're fully into that, the passed out types, the happy singing types, or whatever else. But what I found is with all of them staying there, they end up with a dependence on that that gets them into a world of trouble in their life. With absolutely none of them have I ever known somebody who said, that's where I want to end up, where alcohol takes control of my life. How'd they start there? That one drink. That's how they started down that path. But what did it do? It gave an ability for them to partake in excess. And that's typically what happened. The idea is very clear then, as the wise writer talked about it, don't look at it. Take extensive ways to stay away from that. Where is the case that would justify moderate drinking? If I'm going to say it's all right to do that in wine where I don't get drunk, what passage would teach that? 1 Peter 4 condemns that it's wrong at the loss of control, wrong at that happy buzz, wrong at the point of a lesser level than that. Where do I find the passage, while this would be condemned, where do I find the passage that authorizes that moderate use in a non-medicinal, social, or recreational fashion? Again, what does this scripture tell us? It says you prove all things. You hold fast that which is good. When there are efforts to justify a passage, sometimes people go over and they say, well, 1 Timothy 5, Paul told Timothy, use a little wine for your stomach's sake. We're talking about a medicinal use there. I have no problem with that. If that's what's there, that can be used, and there is not something. What we're wanting to know, where's the passage that has to do with recreational or social uses? Some go over and they say, well, Jesus turned the water into wine, and since it was the best, it had to be that which was fermented, because you know it gets better with age as it ferments. That's our concept. You can go back and find the prices that are available on any number of clay tablets that have been found in the biblical world for prices for different commodities. You know, when you talked about a product of the grape, you know what was the cheapest that was available? That which was given that naturally had fermented and reached that point. That was the cheapest you could have. The very most expensive was that which was fresh from the press, what we would call grape juice. Next to that would be that which was preserved by the olive oil being poured, then that which was the pulp that had come from boiling it down and taking off the yeast so that fermentation could not take place. Our idea is the best is that which is fermented, but that wasn't their concept. And by the way, if Jesus, of his own divine power, created something that exists, don't you think it would be the best? That they never had tasted anything that good? That doesn't suggest something that's going to help the social drinker. In Luke chapter 7, John was referred to as not drinking wine, but they said Jesus did. Now, number one, I would hesitate to take the words of the enemies of Jesus with regard to something. But in this particular case, what's being referred to? John was a Nazirite from birth. Part of the Nazirite vow is that you could not partake of a product of the grape. That's one of the reasons I know that vow was not the Nazirite vow that Paul paid for others. Otherwise, they couldn't partake of the Lord's Supper. The Nazirite vow demanded that you do not eat that or drink that which is a product of the grape. Jesus did, but he drank oinos, not an oinos that would be an intoxicant nature, obviously, but that which was seen to be wise, staying away from that and using that which was non-intoxicating. Or in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 3:8. We sometimes hear people saying, well, the elders, they're not to be given to wine, but the deacons are told not given to much wine, and therefore a deacon can have a little bit and an elder can't have any. No. If I told you, don't get high on dope, does that mean you can use it a little bit as long as you don't get high? No. What I'm saying is don't get it, because that's what will happen. If you use this, this is the effect. And that's the point that is being made here. Two different ways of just saying the exact same thing. They stayed away from it. And might I suggest, as we think about that, what happened with Timothy back up there? What was his standard practice before Paul wrote him this letter? Take a little wine for your stomach's sake. Said what? Up to that point, he wasn't taking any. I wonder why. Would he have been one of those fellows who was just a Pharisaical guy, like some of our brethren say, who try to justify this? Would he have been some hard-hearted old auntie out there that was just trying to be against anything? Or would he have been one who was trying to the best of his ability to live as Christ would have him to live? And be one who was of service to Christ, that Paul commended as I have no man like-minded? I'd suggest to you it's the latter. When you look at the idea of alcohol, Abraham Lincoln once said, alcohol has many defenders but no defense. I thought that was a good point. That's exactly right. When you look at a Christian, what is he being called to? Prove all things, hold fast that which is good. Can you prove social drinking to be good and hold it fast? How about when you look at the idea of Colossians 3:16 or 17? Do all in the name or by the authority of the Lord. Can you show me the passage where the Lord authorized that social, non-medicinal, recreational use of intoxicants? In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 31, we're to do all to the glory of God. That in our life, all of it ought to be that which is done to the glory of God. How can you do that with drinking an intoxicant? Just what about the partaking of that leads someone to glorify God in doing that? Over in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 through 15, the point is that we need to glorify God and put to silence those who are evil. That they look at our life and they have nothing to say that's evil against us because they've recognized we truly are following that path of right. What about social drinking does that? What about the idea of saying I can go out here and drink moderately, maybe give it a little bit of a buzz even, but it's okay? What about that would call them to see that we truly are living to glorify God in our life? In Luke chapter 17, verses 1 and 2, Jesus warned those who would be a stumbling block to others, it'd be better that a millstone be hanged about your neck and you cast into the sea. If I come along and entice others to be involved in that drinking of alcohol, there's something that is made very clear by those who are experts in that realm. And that is anywhere from 1/10 is the lowest I've seen to about 1/4 of those who partake of that one drink will have problems with drinking sometime in their life, with an habitual use of that, with it having some control over them. Am I ready to play Russian roulette not only with my own soul but with somebody else's as well? I need to recognize the fact that I need to lead my life in such a way that it leads others away from the problem, not toward what can be a problem. In 1 Corinthians 10:32, do not cause offense, but bring a profit to others, meaning the idea bringing a profit to them to live as they ought to live before Christ. Moderate drinking doesn't do that. 1 Peter chapter 3, 15 through 17, live in such a way that's beyond reproach, that they have no kind of an evil to say. That is a shame. We show the shame of that evil in our life. Is that what we do by moderate drinking, social drinking of alcohol out there? In Matthew chapter 5, we're to let our light so shine before men that they see our good works and glorify our Father who's in heaven. I want to ask you something. If you go into the bar and partake of a drink, what person's going to look at you honestly and say, that person's helping to lead me to Christ? You can't possibly have any idea of that doing so. Or how about in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 11, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather even reprove them or expose them. If I engage in the very practice that comes to captivate people, that comes to enslave them in the drunkenness and the dependence that's there on alcohol, how in the world am I going to be one who truly exposes that and reproves it as I ought? You know, people sometimes have this in a way of looking at it in a kind of an esoteric ivory tower way that, oh, well, it's not so bad, and they want to make it more of a philosophical point. Let me tell you something. I have a real hard time doing that, and there's a real simple reason why. There are several people that have been very close to me in my life that now live with the problem of alcoholism. People that were once obedient to Christ. People that started out in living that life, but the alcohol has taken it to such a point that they battle with that every day of their life. Young people, let me tell you something. When somebody comes to you with that first drink, they're going to present it as a liberating experience to you, and it is not. You need to recognize it for what it is. It is an enslaving experience. And what you need to do is say no to that. I lived knowing that there was one grandfather that was alive through the early part of my life that I didn't know. The reason was he had left my father and my grandmother when my dad was just about 15 years old in the home because of alcohol that led him into multiple adultery and other things. He used to be a Bible class teacher. He had helped to start a congregation just a little bit to the south and west of Fort Worth. He had been one who had brought others to the Lord, but he started in with just that one little drink. He died as someone who was in cancer because of the liver, as a drunk who didn't care anything about anybody. I saw that life. I saw it up close. And I saw what it did to my father and what it did to my mother. Young people, I'm not trying to deprive you of something joyous. I'm trying to deprive you of a long time of enslavement to something that will take away not only your well-being, but it'll take away your responsibility, will take away your relationships, and will ultimately take away your life as the end of that. What we as God's people need to do is remember that our place is not to be in those that engage in this kind of thing. What we need to do is just exactly what 2 Corinthians chapter 6 talks about. Not be those who are unequally yoked with unbelievers and to partake in that. But I want to draw your mind especially down to chapter 7, verse 1, which is just the completion of the thought, started back in 2 Corinthians 6:14. Therefore, here's the conclusion. Therefore, having these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. Instead of trying to figure out exactly how much alcohol I can have, why not figure out how holy I can get and how much I can grow in fear and reverence of God? That'll get me somewhere, and that'll get others somewhere as well as they're led to Christ through that life. If you're here this evening and you've never obeyed the gospel's call, we haven't talked about that gospel plan of salvation during this lesson. But if you recognize in your life you have done those things that are wrong, that have you at being at odds with God, of being divided and separated from Him, we hope you this evening will decide that you're going to be obedient unto the gospel's call. Jesus said, "He that believes and is baptized shall be saved." If you're ready to do that tonight and be baptized into Christ for the remission of your sin, then we're ready to help you in that way. If you've strayed from that path, having initially become obedient unto Christ, but you've been an erring child of God and you need to come back to Him, pray God. As you are repenting and praying Him, He promises that He'll cleanse you from all iniquity there if you will but meet His terms. If it's public in nature, we'll pray with you and for you. If it's private in nature, you can go to God alone in prayer in a private time. But if we might help you to do that this evening, we hope you'll come while we stand and sing.